It is now my honor, without further ado, to introduce our guest tonight, Genevieve Yue. Yue is an assistant professor of culture and media at the New School, and where she also directs the Screen Studies program. She is also an author and critic, and is currently working on a documentary film. She serves on the board of directors of the Flaherty and is a member of Princeton University's CPUC Ad Hoc Committee on Sexual Climate, Culture, and Conduct. And now for a talk on her book, Girlhead, Feminism and Film Materiality, published in November 2020 by Fordham University. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Genevieve Yue.
Okay. Thank you so much, KJ, for bringing me out here. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first in-person book event, so it feels like it's very new and exotic. So I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you, Jim, up in the booth. Thank you, Mark and Morgan, for being here tonight, too. I'm very excited to talk with you later. My voice is in a kind of weird state post-COVID, so I'm all clear, but I may be coughing a little bit, so apologize for that as well. I'm going to talk tonight about the China Girl, which is the kind of foundational object and image in my thinking around materiality and gender and film. And I'm going to tell a bit of the story of how I came to even recognize this object and how it shaped my thinking in this area. And I want to be very intentional in describing it as an it rather than a she. I noticed in my own writing that I would often slip into she, or when other people would talk about the figure, talk about it as a she. But first and foremost, I think it's very much an object that's used in quality control procedures in the film laboratory. And its appearance is standard. So what you see here is an image of a woman in close-up, positioned next to color swatches and patches of white, gray, and black. It's a tool used for calibration of film images and film processing equipment, and it helps to maintain a standard, and some would say ideal appearance for the film image. And specifically, it maintains an ideal appearance for the human figure and the appearance of flesh. But the temptation to employ the pronoun she persists when discussing the China Girl. And to start, the figure within the image is almost always a woman, a face, and an enigmatic one at that. The China Girl image is a kind of portrait by which, under the right circumstances, we are invited to gaze upon the subtly smiling woman. Who is she? How does she come to be here? We might ascribe to her a mysterious power of the sort that transfixed Madeline Ulster in Vertigo. And in this way, she carries with it a sense of excess. When I was conducting research for my book, several lab technicians, many of whom were retired or nearing the end of their careers, admitted to me a strong attachment to the China Girl figure. What other laboratory device could evoke such strong emotion other than a face? As an excess, she's more than a mere tool, more than an immediate context. Like the most beguiling of Andy Warhol's screen tests, her look pulls away from its surroundings. We meet a gaze and risk getting lost in it. So in a way, the China Girl is both an it and a she, something in between. It marks a conjunction of technical object and gender, and is an indication of the degree to which these aspects are often inseparable from one another. My book extends this analysis of technicity and gender to various sites of film production that, like the film laboratory, occur prior to representation as we most commonly encounter it. So for this evening's presentation, I'll be focusing specifically on the China Girl in the film laboratory, its history, and its secondary appearance in a number of experimental films, several of which we'll see later on tonight. Before delving into the history of the China Girl, I'd like to address the particular issues of looking that are raised when we consider this figure. For those of us who have watched projected analog film, it is very likely that we have seen some China girls before. And this is because anytime a projectionist fails to switch over a film reel at the appointed time, allowing the end of the reel to run out, a viewer might catch a few frames of China girl on the film leader. John Pitlack, the Kodak engineer who developed the laboratory aimed density system, or LAD, in 1976, opined that, quote, "She has probably been in more movies than any other actress in the world," end quote. But even in these cases, we in large part fail to take notice. Even when we might see a China girl image this way, we may not properly register it. Rather, it is something that is hidden in plain sight. It wasn't until I saw Morgan Fisher's Standard Gauge, which we will watch together later on this evening, that I became aware of the China girl figure. Fisher's film is organized as a kind of show and tell of various film scraps he'd collected working in stock footage libraries and as an editor on low-budget features. Winding strips of 35mm film over a light box, he pauses on several examples of China girls to comment on them. He explains their function in film laboratories, where they are crucial to calibrating a film's final appearance. Yet little is known about their provenance, who the models were, and how, in the United States at least, these women came to be named China girls. Though Fisher describes the China girl as a, quote, figure who in some quarters is emblematic almost of film itself, end quote, the smiling women in the film leader remain largely enigmatic. So the China girl has been an enduring, if mostly imperceptible, figure in film history as well. There's been little scholarly attention paid to it, and it also does not feature in technical literature. Rather, its history is vernacular, the result of practices handed down among technicians and remaining largely outside of official written manuals. In my research, I've been able to glean a history of the China girl from accounts of the procedures and instruments with which it is associated. This includes, for example, the densitometer, an instrument for measuring the density of film images. And the first reference to, quote, a close-up of a girl that I was able to find in Journal of the SMPE, which was the chief and still is professional journal for the film industry. This occurs in 1933 in an article on the usage of the densitometer. And though the densitometer first appeared in the journal in 1923, the early 1930s mention of a close-up of a girl accords with the arrival of sound technologies in film, and with them the need for more stringent quality control measures to maintain consistency in audio quality. Also from the 30s is the earliest example of a China girl I've been able to find, which you see right here. And similarly, according, by this logic of pegging the appearance of the China girl to technological developments, later appearances of the China girl in the technical literature, things like girl head or China doll, the other names that are often used, coincide historically with developments in color processes, television. So these kind of major technological shifts often mark the renewed need to have more precise quality control instruments. And technological developments worldwide then followed the work being done within the U.S. context, including at the Kodak Research Laboratories, which was closely aligned with the Society for Motion Picture Engineers, the industry's main professional organization. Therefore, every country to have a major motion picture industry also ended up producing its own China girls. From what I believe to be its emergence then in the late 1920s and early 30s, the China girl, as such, continues in limited use today. And this happens wherever the processing of film stock continues to occur, as for example in the conversion between film and digital technologies. It has analogs in digital media as well. Here's an example of an actual Asian woman used for a printer reference chart. Other uses include images for monitor calibration reference sheets. As the name suggests, the China girl encodes attitudes about race. One of the many questions I was unable to satisfactorily answer in my research concerns the origin of the name. Why is it called a China girl? Various explanations I encountered had to do with china as a material, as in porcelain, or the preciousness of china dolls. We see in the various names of china girls a slippage between material and race. The models, for example, are often adorned with Orientalist details in dress, hairstyle, and, as reported in one case, a straw coolie hat. In the 1970s, Kodak posed many of its china girl models in the same mandarin collared blouse, and you'll see this woman in the lower right-hand corner, again tonight in Mark Toscano's Releasing Human Energies. The linking of race, gender, and material is confirmed in the china girl's name outside of the U.S. context. In France, it is known as Lily, La Chinoise, Codaquette, and La Bride, with the latter referring to the slanted shape of Asian eyes. In Thailand, Mue or Armue is used, also referring to the appearance of a Chinese girl. Japanese technicians employ China girl as an English language phrase, as do laboratory workers in India and Slovenia. Mexico uses muñeca or mona, both of which refer to dolls, and laboratories in Austria refer to them as conchita, which in Spanish means little shell and is also slang for little cunt. More broadly, this Orientalism is suggested in the stereotypical notion of Asian femininity, that women be subordinate and submissive, qualities that would be useful for the technological function the image serves. Given the fact, then, that nearly all China girls in Western countries are racially white, the woman's idealized appearance means an index based on her white skin. The notion of perfect or ideal skin tone, of course, is routinely conflated with whiteness. The idea that one single skin tone can be representative for all others, whether restricted to the tonal range of white skin or inclusive of non-white values, speaks to the degree to which whiteness is perceived as natural, ubiquitous, neutral, and to a great extent invisible or inconspicuous. This is like the China girl herself. The aim for an ideal is also measured as a norm. In his study of whiteness and photographic media, Richard Dyer observed an inherent, what he called racial character of technologies that reveals itself in the use of white skin tone as a measure for all others. As a racial trait, whiteness might be ideologically neutral or invisible, but in fact in color analysis, it nevertheless registers a range of chromatic values. This racial character means that these technologies are designed according to perceived markers of racial differentiation, even if they are not themselves tantamount to racism. Dyer writes, quote, "Stocks, cameras, and lighting were developed taking the white face as the touchstone. The resultant apparatus came to be seen as fixed and inevitable, existing independently of the fact that it was humanly constructed. It may be, certainly was true, that film and photography have seemed to work better with light-skinned peoples, but that is because they were made that way, not because there could be no other way." End quote. Against the presumed neutrality and objectivity of imaging technologies, racial biases nevertheless have governed the development of film stocks, chemicals, and other machines that produce the very conditions by which representation can even occur. Returning to the question of how to look at the China girl, then, it is important to understand that the figure appears within the material construction of film and not at the level of the projected image. The result of this conceptually is that it exposes a gap between the surface appearance of a film and the complex orchestration of its materiality in terms of gender, labor, and industry. The China girl is then the opposite of the women who appear on screen. It is not a figure in film, but one used for film. In other words, it shows how the functioning of the film laboratory requires for it to be understood only as material and never a person in the sense of its leading lady counterparts. Additionally, the anonymity of China girl models, and they're almost never credited, indicates how the woman's vanishing into brute material is necessary to the transformation of her into an instrument fundamental to the operation of the film laboratory. I turn now to the China girl's curious appearance in experimental film. and this is both a conclusion and an invitation. The figure has been especially compelling for filmmakers associated with structural film, or that tendency within experimental film to reveal a project of revealing different aspects of the cinematic apparatus, including light, projection, or the film strip itself. Many filmmakers examine the function of film production practices and link the China Girl, link these practices to the enigmatic appearance of the China Girl as a woman. So broadly speaking, I see the appearance of the China Girl in experimental film as a kind of test case for the various modes of looking that the figure involves. This can mean moving it from the margins to the center of the frame, or maintaining its supposedly natural appearance, which would be inserted in the midst of film leader miscellany, as in the case of Michelle Silva's film. As we will now begin the screening portion of the evening, I invite you to be mindful of the way that the China Girl model appears in the films that you see, to attend to what is being revealed, what might otherwise escape notice, and what obstructions might still remain. Following the screening, please stay for what promises to be a very exciting conversation with Morgan Fisher and Mark Toscano. Thank you for your attention and enjoy.
So thank you for sticking around, and a hand one more time for the film program that Genevieve put together. I'm going to introduce our other guests. You were introduced to Genevieve earlier. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mark Toscano and Morgan Fisher. Mark Toscano is a curator, film preservationist, and educator, and as we saw tonight, an occasional filmmaker based in Los Angeles. Since 2003, he has worked at the Academy Film Archive, where he specializes in the curation, conservation, and restoration of independent and artists' films. He is a programmer with Los Angeles Film Forum, and since 2015 has taught in the experimental animation program at the California Institute of the Arts. Morgan Fisher received a BA in art history from Harvard College, then moved to Los Angeles to attend film school. In 1968, he began making short films, which have shown at the Oberhausen, Berlin, London, and New York film festivals, and at MoCA, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney, just to name a few. His most recent film, Another Movie from 2017, was shown at the Berlin and London film festivals, among others. Toward the end of the 90s, he extended his practice to include painting, drawing, photography, and installation. He has been a visiting teacher at Brown, CalArts, and here at UCLA, and he lives and works in Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our panel this evening.
So I brought a couple of China Girls. I just grabbed them from work. Because when you're a film preservationist, you encounter a lot of these. So afterwards, if anybody wants to check these out, I'll be in the lobby. That was a really amazing talk. I haven't read your book yet, so I only finally got it tonight. But yeah, that was fantastic, and I love the inclusion of the Faroki film. Could you talk a little about that, actually?
Yes. Well, I programmed a two-part series of films at Metrograph in New York during the early stages of the pandemic. And it was loosely based on my book, and it was a program called Implicit Movies, and the idea was that I wanted to draw out things that were hidden but there in film processes, but I suppose in any phenomenon. So I think the Faroki film is kind of funny, and it's like so anti-erotic, right? It's like it's a construction of an erotic, a Playboy shoot, and there's so much fussing over the image, and there's so much work involved. It's so banal in a way, and I wanted to I didn't find a place for it in the book, but I put it in the Metrograph program, and then I thought when I was putting a program together for tonight, I didn't want to just do China Girl films. That just seemed a little like too obvious, but I wanted to bring in another realm of labor, of image production, and to describe the tedium, the precision, the process of setting that up. And one thing I think is really amazing about the Faroki is there's so little talking. They're like little murmurs and things, but the people who are putting this shoot together know so well what they're doing that they don't really have a whole lot to say to each other. That it's so just a routine thing. So I don't know. I wanted to bring that into the picture. I'm interested always in process and labor and just imagining what it's like to be. Well, I've never been like a model, so I don't know what it's like to just sit there while other people just kind of like fuss over you. And your film brings that out so much, of like the labor of sitting there and evidently being told to smile and like to look pretty, and that's an aspect of even the China Girl that we don't typically see. So moving from Michelle Silva's film, which is like the typical way that we might encounter a China Girl, which is in the midst of all this other kinds of countdown leader and things like that, to get to the point where you're confronted with what is it like in this, like the full, sensual way of just having to sit there while, and all the other work that goes into making that. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but to get to that.
When I first stumbled on that footage that I used for my movie, it was in maybe 2008 or 9, and the thing that I think blew me away the most was that clearly she is being told to smile, or she knows she's supposed to smile at certain intervals, but that's not necessary for her image to function as this control image. Like the smiling is from this other place, this idea of portraiture, and but a certain kind of portraiture and a certain kind of objectifying portraiture, and I just thought that was so unreal that, like, why does she need to smile? I mean,
well, everything about it is excessive, right? Like it doesn't need to be a woman, it doesn't need to be a smiling woman. I mean, there are exceptions, right? We've seen China Girls that are dogs, or there was the doll, the mannequin, the BBC mannequin.
I've seen a baby one, and I've seen only one man. Have you seen?
I've seen others? Yeah, I think you sent me this, the China boy.
Yeah, the China boy. It's from a Cinerama movie.
Yeah.
And my theory was this: my colleague Andrew Bradburn at the Academy of Film Archive found that, because we have the Cinerama collection at the Academy, and my theory was that it was such a small company initially that was doing this experimental 3-camera process that they probably just had a small staff, and this is probably just one of the technicians, like, just get in front of the camera or something. I mean, what a find, though. I have to really thank Andrew for that one.
These are all the exceptions that prove the rule, I think. I mean, no, I remember when you brought in that piece of film to the Getty Research Institute, and that was a revelation. I mean, there are various revelations for me in this project, but just to see her a live person, it's kind of squirming a little bit. And for it to be durational, and to not see that as like a flat image, but she's like sitting behind some cards, is always kind of shocking to me. And I'm curious to know about when both of you first became aware of this figure, because I learned from both of your works to pay attention to it. So I'm curious to hear where that came for both of you.
Well, Morgan, we were talking in the lobby. We perhaps first became aware because of the same film, right? Except at different times.
But the film that Mark is talking about is a film by a filmmaker who, at the time he made it, was known as George Landau, but later became Owen Land, and it's called A Film in Which There Appears what, sprocket
Sprocket
holes.
holes,
Dirt particles,
edge
edge lettering, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, so it has this deliberately elaborate title, and there's a very brief clip of the same China girl that is the first that I show. I think it's the same one, isn't it?
I think so.
It's a very brief clip, but it was a motion picture scene, and so she blinks. So there's this very brief moment of action, and it's repeated. So that's probably when I became aware of it. And then when I was working in 35, I encountered Pieces, a film that had the China girl in it, and I had this. I mean, basically, my film is about my obsession with 35. So it's so those images just I could understand them as being, contained within that obsession. I'm not obsessed anymore. The film, I think, was actually a kind of exorcism. It was like therapeutic, how to escape from the power of 35. But could I just comment on something? In your film, well, I mean, we understand that anyone who's being posed for a photograph is being directed, as we saw from the Faroki film, but so any China girl, even if it's just a few seconds long, has been directed. But this one was like really directed. There was sustained direction. Someone was telling her something, probably a man, was telling her from off camera to do stuff. So it's as if she were being directed back in the silent period, for one thing. But all of a sudden, we become aware of there being a director of a kind that's different if it's just a fraction of a second, as we see in the George Landau film, where it's a motion picture scene but so short that we don't really think about the fact that someone has set up the shot and has told this person exactly where to stand, how to act, how to hold her head, and so it's very different. And so there's this other history of the directors of China girls, whom, I mean, I don't know of anyone who, if China girls are anonymous, then the directors of China girls are even more so. We don't even know what they look like.
I mean, I've talked to a couple.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I'm so
I mean,
envious.
it's in the book. My memory's a little dim, but this is sort of the thing. When I would contact lab technicians or usually retirees, they're like pretty active in their little like listserv groups. But I would contact people, and they were pretty eager to talk to me about it. I mean, they wouldn't see it as directing. That's what's interesting. It was just kind of like a function of the job, to go set up. Now it's time to go set up a room, some lights and camera, and it's just part of the practice of doing laboratory work, as opposed to, obviously, like a film director in that sense.
Are you scandalized that I want to insist that they're film directors?
No, I love this idea.
Okay. No,
It makes me think differently about film directing, actually.
I can't wait to hear what you're going to say next.
I mean that they're like the image of the film director is this tyrannical figure, controlling figure. Actually, this like undercuts that a little bit. It's just like, this is some of that comes out of just like the structure of that kind of labor of. So what I mean by that is like it's not like a personality trait of. I mean, we have like these like myths of like people like Hitchcock, who just want to control everything, but. To imagine a film director as being more akin to a laboratory worker is fascinating. It's like it kind of brings us back to the studio system.
Yeah, I'm not saying they're auteurs, but they're off camera and they're telling the person who's in front of the camera what to do.
Yeah.
That's directing.
Well, I guess in the footage that I used in my film, yeah, there's clearly some choice is being made by one or more people on how this woman should behave in front of the camera for whatever reasons they have. It's not germane to the purpose that she's being filmed for. But yeah, it's kind of funny, like why, and why the outfit, and why any number of other things, as you mentioned. I actually love too in that footage. Sometimes she's smiling just being told and on cue, and it's obviously very artificial, kind of forced smile. But there are one or two moments where she seems to smile genuinely and laugh a little bit in responding to who knows what. If somebody's deliberately trying to make her laugh, somebody said something, or who knows what. And I love that. And actually, that's the sort of implicit presence of the director, I suppose, too, or the crew, is that we're aware of them because of her reactions in a way, and what she's performing.
Well, I'm interested actually that you pair the footage with an incredibly like overbearing, like, it's like manager manual kind of voice. That's your voice, but like brought into from this book that you have about like telling managers how to manage things. So
Yeah, when I thought of insidious, like kind of authoritarian voices, I thought of Morgan instantly. I wanted him to. No, I'm just kidding, Morgan. I'm just kidding.
But it's also gendered because, of course, that the person you're speaking of is a he.
yeah.
Only exclusively a he. Yeah. I mean, to say the obvious, but
Can you talk about where that came from?
Yeah, well, I don't mean to be the show and tell guy, but I actually brought the book tonight that I have. This is it here. It's got the weirdest cover too. Again, I'm happy to show this to anybody that wants to look at it. But in the late '50s, my dad, his mom's second husband, my grandma's second husband, had operated a tavern in Hartford, Connecticut, and then he died and left it. My grandmother ended up with it, and my dad didn't have a job at that time and ended up helping her run it. And so in the course of doing that and kind of figuring out how to do it, I guess he bought a few books on restaurant management, and in this one's from the early '60s actually, this edition. And at some point, I don't know why over 50 years he kept it, but at some point in, again, probably the late aughts, no, it would have been a little later. I guess it was around 2011, because it was encountering this book that I found that essay, which is literally called Releasing Human Energies. And no joke, I opened up the book randomly, and that was what was staring at me, is this essay about how to manage your staff by aligning their presumed personal goals with your kind of corporate ones. And immediately I thought of the China Girl, which I had thought, oh, it'd be interesting if somehow that could make its way into a film, because it's really remarkable footage. I mean, first and foremost, that footage was really amazing to me, because I think, like a lot of people, I hadn't assumed that was even live action material always. And then to realize here's 5 straight minutes of it, that really was, I'd just never seen it before, and I don't think anybody else I'd ever spoken to had either. And yeah, somehow it just clicked with me that they both had to do with this sort of invisible machinations behind certain forms of labor, and the way that there's something kind of creepy about it on a lot of different levels. I mean, I'm simplifying, but then yeah, and I mean, I couldn't help but ask Morgan to perform the voiceover. I mean, for a few reasons. One, I really love Morgan's speaking voice, but also one of my early encounters with the idea of the China Girl was, of course, Standard Gauge, and I just really love his voiceover in that. And I thought, without wanting to trivialize the film, in a way, it also, I guess, ends up being a bit of an in-joke for experimental film fans, I suppose. But first and foremost was I really loved his the lucidity and the clarity of his delivery, and I thought it was just perfect. So, and I work with Morgan as an archivist to work on restoring his films. So I asked him if he would do this. He was very, very generous to say yes. And I don't know, how did you feel seeing it tonight? How do you feel about hearing yourself in a film that's not yours?
well, if it were the only film on the program, I would be perfectly happy. But for those of you who might have gotten sick of my voice, you have only Mark to, well, Genevieve and Mark together to blame. But yeah, I mean, I'll do it. I'll do it again if you want me to. If you think it can be. No, I noticed I took a couple of breaths. You can hear me taking a breath, and of course, we try to eliminate those in the editing. Did you work on the track? Did you try to edit?
Yeah, it's actually 2 performances edited together, and I did take out some breaths. I didn't take out all of them, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, there are some breaths in the track for standard gauge that I hadn't heard before. So it's back to the cutting room. But not really. But
Well, and speaking of invisible labor, this is maybe slightly off topic, but I've always been amazed, and if it's not clear to all of you, even if you've seen standard gauge before, that's all one take. That's a real-time single take, a 1,200-foot magazine of film, which is roughly 33 minutes, and that's quite a remarkable achievement, I think, because that's an incredibly precisely framed shot as well, and the precision with which you produce the film has always kind of blown me away. I don't know how much testing went into that. Quite a bit, I imagine.
some, yeah. I just wanted to mention, thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to mention, in 16, 1,200 feet is, as Mark said, 33 minutes, and the take is 32 minutes. But the longest take in 35, the longest roll of film in 35 is 1,000 feet, which is 11 minutes. 11 minutes and 6 and a fraction seconds. So in 16, you could do something technically that was not possible in 35 millimeter. So Hollywood, for all of its resources, couldn't make a film like standard gauge because you can't do a 33-minute take in 35 millimeter. You can in 16, but not in 35. Although Samuel Fuller, I think I read about this or I heard him speak about this. He wanted to make a movie where it was set in the military, and there would be a scene where men were marching, and there'd be a tracking shot, and there would be changeovers between cameras as the shot went on. So it was going to end up being, in effect, 3 maybe, more than 2 I think, but maybe 3 separate 35 millimeter camera rolls that would do their best to conceal the fact that there were in fact breaks between the reels. And the way he spoke about it, a part of what interested him in this was that no matter what, the men had to keep marching. In other words, the requirement that this be executed as a continuous action would oblige people to keep marching because the cameras, first the one, then the other, then a third, were going to keep rolling. And I thought that was an interesting idea, that in Fuller's conception of the shot, there was this connection between duration and what the duration obligated on the part of performers. Yeah, the performers had to keep on performing. They had no choice. In ordinary production, if something goes wrong, you're a few seconds into the take, you just say cut. Then you're on to take 2 or take 3, whatever it is. But that's one of the ways to think about Hitchcock, is that Hitchcock was very interested in the material limitations of film as something in relation to which to operate. And the obvious example is rope, which consists of very long takes that he does his best to conceal the fact that it's in fact separate shots, although there are some cuts that are more obvious than others, but it's done in order to create the illusion that it's one continuous performance, when in fact, obviously, it's not. I mean, it couldn't be. But one of the things that standard gauge is about what's possible in a single take. We tend to think of single takes as being. This was the beef with Warhol. These single take movies were they didn't tell us anything that just looking at the scene in real life would tell us. And one of the motives for making standard gauge was to show that single take films could in fact be complicated. So that's why I talked about under Capricorn, another Hitchcock film with very long takes.
I also love that it's a single take film that nevertheless has many shots.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So you get to have it both ways somehow.
yes. Thank you so much.
But were you were recording your dialogue over while you were running the film?
No, it would have been impossible for me to speak into a mic and give a perfect performance and at the same time manipulate the film.
Okay.
So it was done to playback. I recorded the narration and then we played it back and I performed I manipulated the pieces of film in relation to the playback. So it looks as if it's sync, but it's not. It looks as if it were shot in sync. Well, but it's not really because it's done to playback. So it's like a music video in its way. But that's a question. Is it narration or is it off screen? Am I a narrator or am I a character speaking from off screen? This is a serious. I've asked myself this question. I lie awake at night. Am I the narrator, or am I an off-screen character? I mean, if you were to pan over, you would see me. You would see me. You never see a narrator. When you have a narrated film, the narrator is not in the diegetic space.
But then that's interesting you bring up Detour, that moment, where you don't even show anything from Detour and yet you reference Detour because that actually is doing a similar thing.
No, the whole point, I was so glad to find this little piece of this film by Ulmer because it gave me a chance to bring up this other film by Ulmer called Detour, where there's this extraordinary thing that happens at the end of the film. So, so here's the Naked Dawn. Oh, and by the way, this gives me a chance to talk about what happens at the end of Detour, which is a great film. Of course, I hope I'm correct in making the assumption that you all have seen Detour. It's and you've all seen The Honeymoon Killers. This is a great film. It's a shame that there are people who don't know this film. It's a great film. Martin Scorsese was the first director, but he was fired because he wasn't fast enough. So it was other people finished it, or made the film and got the credit. It's a great film.
I was wondering, I don't know if anybody in the audience has any questions too, because if it's such a rich subject, and I feel like you're now the world expert on this topic, and you've thought about it in so many different ways and from so many different perspectives that I feel like Morgan and I just live here, but you're a guest and you're like a rare resource here. So
I just have a lot of unanswered questions still. So that's I don't want to claim expert status, except that I guess I'm an expert at the questions that you would uncover, looking for very simple questions actually, like why is it called a China girl when it's a white woman? Where does that name come from? So in that sense, it's been pretty frustrating, but I guess that allowed me to do some more theoretical maneuvers with the material. I actually want to follow up, Morgan, with a question to you, which is like, are you the same voice? Is the voice, do you see yourself or whatever you are in standard gauge, is that the same persona that appears in Releasing Human Energies? I'm curious to both of you for the answer to that question.
I don't think I could possibly answer that.
I'm stumped. I don't know what to say. Maybe I don't understand. Persona? Am I the okay? So
Like that
there's a
voice.
distinction. Yeah.
The voice, I mean, it's interesting because now for standard gauge, so your voice precedes the material. You're recording the material to the voice.
That's correct.
And then it flips in Releasing Human Energies, because there's the footage that pre-exists the voice. And then I don't know if you recorded the voice watching the footage or how that came about, but
For my film.
yeah.
Oh no, I don't think I showed you the footage. I think yeah, we sat in the little movie theater in the film archive where I work, and I just had written up the text, and you just gave it a few readings, and I just recorded. It's pretty lo-fi, but
Like, I'm just imagining the camera drifting off frame, and like, are we gonna see Morgan there?
right.
You know, like in the Faroki, would you see like all the technicians like constructing something?
Well, one thing I've always loved about Standard Gauge is how personal it is and how autobiographical it is, and the way that it's really becomes this semi-incidental autobiography that's told just through your reminiscences about these pieces of film. And some of the reminiscences are extremely anecdotal and personal, and then some of them relate to film history outside of you. And I mean, there's just so many layers to it for me. I really love it. And I love that the last sequence is you're just saying, here are some pieces of film I think are interesting to look at. And you're inviting us to also find them interesting, hopefully. And it's like you're sharing a collection with us. It's very intimate. And so, but for my film, it's deliberately both impersonal, but also I think the narration, although it has, like I said, Morgan has a wonderful lucidity and clarity to his delivery. It has a warmth to it for me too. And so, but I mean, in terms of it's like a similar persona, I don't think so, because I mean, when I see Standard Gauge, I'm very aware of it. Like Morgan is telling us stories about these things, and we're learning something about his life a bit.
I just hear in his narration in Releasing Human Energies, your narration, a kind of ironizing effect. So that text, which is very sincere in its way, does not come across as, you know, because it's being voiced by you and because we have Standard Gauge in our heads, it comes across differently than just that, you know, the surface level understanding of what it means to manipulate your staff.
Mark, you can always find another narrator and redo it.
Well, it's true. In your case, yours needed to be narrated by you because you're really telling,
It's your life.
about yourself and your experiences. It didn't have to be, but it makes sense on that level. Whereas mine, it's deliberately this kind of nearly anonymous, impersonal text. So.
Yeah, and anyone could be the narrator. Anyone. Yeah, actually, I'm sure you know the film Nostalgia by Hollis Frampton. And Nostalgia consists of our being shown a series of still photographs, one after the other, although it's not one continuous shot. They're separate shots, but the framing is the same. And we see a still photograph, and then you hear a voice talking about the circumstances in which the photograph was taken. And all the photographs were taken by Hollis Frampton. And so when he says, so he speaks so the voice speaks in the first person singular, I, but the voice is not belong to Hollis Frampton. The person who we understand is the I that the text says. Instead, it's Michael Snow, and I've never understood that. I've always been baffled by that.
Well, you hear Hollis Frampton in the very beginning.
Oh.
Because Snow is like, is this all right? And you hear this like gruff, deep voice. Like, yeah. But we're getting the signal also to wrap up. I feel, I think we've been getting it for a while. One audience question.
If anybody has a question. Oh, wait, over there. Yeah. Sorry, I don't think the microphone's on or working, and I can't hear, unfortunately.
You can just speak loudly. All right, I'll speak loudly.
Oh, everything was a surprise in this book. Yeah, that's what was interesting about this material, I think. And I mean, the not just the China girl stuff, but just like bubbled to the surface in various ways for me, and took a long time to like really wrap my head around. But all the other objects that I kind of gravitated toward in the book, it's actually not so. I don't know. I feel some affinity to standard gauge in this way because it was just like, yes, this is an assortment of things that I found interesting, that like stuck with me, that didn't make sense at first, that I needed to kind of rearrange and look at and find different ways of, yeah, approaching. So I guess that's the kind of, I don't know, like programmer impulse in me, or maybe even I'm not really an archivist, so I won't say that at all. But looking at you, but I don't think I would write about things that didn't surprise me. Thanks.
Is there one? Yeah.
I have a question.
There are a couple actually here. Can we do two more, KJ?
Yeah, do we have a mic that's working or no? Okay.
Yeah.
Just loudly.
Yeah. Who wants to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Tacita.
Observation. Did you think about it being connected to China graph? The China graph pencil that everyone uses and which they use in
Oh
lab.
yeah, like a China marker, like a
I've never
which is
even
for
heard of
marking
this.
on China, right? That's why those are called that, right?
They're like grease pencils. Editors used to use
Yeah.
them. Like you making word print, you mark a cut.
Oh.
But in the UK, we call them China graph.
Yeah.
And in the lab where I first worked, they used to call it the lady.
Hmm.
And
Oh.
she was the lady, and often, she was the idea or impression I got that she was connected to a, married. There was one that I knew, the lady down in Soho Film Lab was married to somebody in the lab. That was it. But it was the lady, and there was a China graph. I just thought maybe there was some connection with the word China graph, which is all what they used to mark films. I just thought that might be some clue.
And that goes back really early in the industry too, using some kind of grease marker, grease pencil. Yeah.
At least in the UK, it was China.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I've never heard that term before, so I would hunt that down. Yeah, I mean, definitely there was a retired lab person, worker listserv, and they were throwing out all kinds of speculative origin stories, but none pointed to the instruments of like marking and notating those kinds of that would be absolutely used in those processes. So, but I would, yeah, maybe there's like a follow-up research project here. Thank you so much.
And there is someone here.
This question is for Genevieve.
Okay.
I'm not clear about, because I've been in the industry for a long time, I never ever heard the term China girl. Is it the standing person? The standing person.
No, not on a set.
Because the standing person is the one that takes all the shots. They measure the light on her.
Mm-hmm.
And because I never heard about the China girl, so maybe it's the same, or is this is a lab?
This is entirely a laboratory
Okay, thank you.
practice. Yeah. I mean, I've seen footage of like the stand-in that has those standard reference colors, but that would appear differently. That would be used differently. Actually, I think I've seen China Girl footage, or not China Girl footage, like footage of like famous actresses. I think often, so I guess not stand-ins, but like running footage with like Romy Schneider or whoever, so that those kind of measurements could be made before actually like shooting a take. But again, that's different from this like purely, the thing about the China girl in the lab is it's entirely divorced from anything you're actually shooting, whatever film you're making. And that was this fascinating piece for me, was why is there this sexualized image of a woman attached to whatever happens? It's like, in one way completely separate from that, and on the other hand, it's physically tethered to it. It's like baked into the same film, and I found that doubleness really interesting.
Yeah, like in among other artists, I work on Stan Brackage's films, and he made a lot of films, and he worked almost exclusively with one laboratory in Colorado that used to be called Western Cine. And in Michelle Silva's film, the very first film, there were a few instances of the Western Cine China girl who I recognized immediately because I look at the Brackage films and I see her all the time. And I was told by the guy that later came to own the lab that she had just been somebody that worked in the lab. I don't know what she did in the lab, but yeah, but it was this idea that I'm guessing that the demographic of the lab staff was probably largely male, and so there was presumably this idea that, well, we have to get the lady that works here like in front of the camera for this purpose. But it's funny because in almost every Brackage film, at least going back a certain like to the 60s even, there's this same person in every single one of the leaders, and so every one of the prints of any Stan Brackage film for about 40 years like has this person in it. And I mean, the story I'd heard reference Hollis Frampton too is apparently when Brackage would show the films, sometimes in public he would run out the leaders so you would actually see her on screen. And Hollis Frampton supposedly asked him once, like, why do you show that? You know, at the end, it's not really part of the film. And apparently Brackage said to him, "Oh, do you mean the muse?" This is kind of a famous little
I've heard of the
China girl
Western
anecdote
Cine
there. Yeah.
movies, yeah.
So should we leave with the muse? Is
might
that
be
yeah?
nice, yeah.
I think that's a good way to frame her, maybe. Right? Yeah.